James Edward Harris stood before the court, his worn-out jacket hanging loosely on his frame, his eyes fixed on the floor. The air in the room was heavy with the weight of judgment, the kind that seemed to settle on him long before the gavel struck. At 58, James was a man who had seen too much: war, loss, and the slow grind of a society that had turned its back on him. His life, once marked by honor, was now reduced to a single charge: theft. A loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a bottle of water from a convenience store. The prosecution called it a crime. James called it survival. The courtroom buzzed with the usual hum of routine. Lawyers shuffled papers, the stenographer's fingers hovered over her machine, and the judge, a stern woman in her late 50s named Margaret Ellis, scanned the docket. To her, this was another case in a long day of petty crimes and procedural monotony. James, with his unkempt beard and tired eyes, looked like just another defendant. But his name, when she read it aloud, changed everything. James Edward Harris, Judge Ellis said, her voice clear and authoritative. The room stilled. She paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked up from the papers. Sergeant James Edward Harris? James lifted his head slightly, unsure if he was meant to respond. He nodded, a small gesture, almost imperceptible. But it was enough. The judge leaned forward, her gaze locking onto him. Sergeant James Edward Harris, recipient of the Silver Star for actions in Fallujah, 2004? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, a burly man who had seen hundreds of defendants pass through, straightened his posture. The prosecutor, a young man named Daniel Carter, froze mid-motion, his pen hovering over his notes. Even the jurors, who had been fidgeting in their seats, leaned forward, their attention now fully on the man in the tattered jacket. "Yes, ma'am," James replied, his voice low but steady. "That's me." The judge's expression softened, but only for a moment. She sat back in her chair, her fingers tapping the edge of her desk. "This court will come to order," she said, though the room was already silent. "And we will show respect." To the surprise of everyone, she stood. The bailiff followed, then the clerk, the stenographer, and the attorneys. One by one, the jurors rose, some with confusion, others with a dawning understanding. The entire courtroom was on its feet, not because of protocol, but because of who James Edward Harris was, or had been. 20 years earlier, James had been a different man. A Marine sergeant in Iraq, he had led his squad through the chaos of Fallujah, a city torn apart by insurgency. On a November day in 2004, his unit was ambushed in a narrow alley. Insurgents rained gunfire from rooftops, and a grenade landed in the midst of his men. Without hesitation, James threw himself toward it, shielding 2 younger Marines from the blast. The explosion left him with shrapnel in his leg and a concussion that would haunt him for years. But his actions saved lives. The Silver Star pinned to his chest was a testament to that day, a day when he was a hero. But heroism doesn't pay rent. It doesn't fill an empty stomach or keep the nightmares at bay. When James returned home to Chicago in 2006, the country he had fought for seemed to have no place for him. The VA was a maze of paperwork and long waits. His leg injury made manual labor difficult, and the trauma in his mind made sleep a battle of its own. He took odd jobs when he could, construction, janitorial work, but the pay was inconsistent, and the city's winters were unforgiving. By 2010, he was sleeping in shelters. By 2015, he was on the streets. The theft charge was simple, almost mundane. A convenience store clerk had caught James slipping a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a bottle of water into his backpack. The clerk called the police, and James didn't run. He stood there, hands raised, and said, "I was hungry." The store owner pressed charges, and now here he was, facing a misdemeanor that could land him in jail for up to a year. The prosecutor, Daniel Carter, cleared his throat and began his opening statement. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a straightforward case. On the evening of March 12, 2025, the defendant, James Edward Harris, entered a convenience store on West 47th Street and took items without paying. The evidence is clear. Security footage shows him placing the items in his bag and leaving the store. This is theft, plain and simple. Carter's voice was confident, but there was a slight hesitation, as if he sensed the shift in the room. He glanced at James, who sat quietly at the defense table, his public defender, a young woman named Sarah Nguyen, scribbling notes beside him. Sarah was overworked, her caseload a mountain of petty crimes and indigent clients. She had met James only briefly before the trial, but something about his demeanor, calm, almost resigned, had struck her. When she learned of his military service, she dug deeper, pulling records from the VA and the Department of Defense. What she found had kept her up the night before. "Your Honor," Sarah began when it was her turn, "my client does not dispute that he took the items. But this case is not as simple as the prosecution suggests. James Harris is a man who served this country with extraordinary bravery. He risked his life for others, and he has been failed by the systems meant to support him. He was hungry, homeless, and desperate. This is not a story of criminal intent, but of survival." The judge listened intently, her eyes occasionally flicking to James. The jurors, too, seemed to hang on Sarah's words. One juror, an older man with a Vietnam veteran's pin on his jacket, nodded slightly. Another, a woman in her 30s, wiped her eyes. The prosecution called a store clerk as their first witness. The clerk, a middle-aged man named Rajesh Patel, recounted the incident with precision. "He came in around 7 p.m., Rajesh said. He looked around, then put the bread, peanut butter, and water in his bag. I asked him to pay, but he just walked out. I called the police." Sarah cross-examined gently but firmly. "Mr. Patel, did Mr. Harris threaten you in any way?" "No," Rajesh admitted. "He didn't say much. Just said he was hungry." "Did he try to run when you confronted him?" "No. He stopped and waited for the police." Sarah nodded, letting the jury absorb the image of a man who didn't flee, who didn't fight, but simply stood there, accepting his fate. The prosecution rested after presenting the security footage and a police report. The video was grainy but clear enough. James, head down, slipping the items into his bag, then walking out. The officer who arrested him testified that James was cooperative, even apologetic. "He said he hadn't eaten in 2 days," the officer added, almost as an afterthought. When it was the defense's turn, Sarah called a single witness, James himself. He took the stand slowly, his limp noticeable but not exaggerated. He swore the oath, his voice steady but soft, and sat down, folding his hands in his lap. "Mr. Harris," Sarah began, "can you tell us why you took the items from the store?" James took a deep breath. "I hadn't eaten in a couple of days. I was staying under the overpass near 47th Street. It was cold, and I was tired. I saw the store and I didn't have money. I didn't want to hurt nobody. I just needed something to keep going." The courtroom was silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Sarah continued, her voice gentle but deliberate. "Can you tell us about your service in the Marines?" James hesitated, as if the question pulled him somewhere he hadn't been in years. "I served from 1998 to 2006. 2 tours in Iraq. I was a sergeant, led a squad of good men. We saw a lot of action in Fallujah. I got hurt, got sent home. They gave me a medal, said I was a hero. But it don't feel like that now." Sarah introduced his military records, including the citation for his Silver Star. She read aloud the account of his actions in Fallujah, how he shielded his men from the grenade, how he carried one of them to safety under fire. The jurors listened, some visibly moved. The Vietnam veteran juror stared at James, his jaw tight. "Mr. Harris," Sarah said, "what happened after you came home?" "It was hard," James said. "The VA helped some, but it was slow. My leg hurt all the time, and I couldn't keep a job. I had nightmares, couldn't sleep. My wife left, took our son. I tried to keep going, but I ended up on the streets. Been there about 10 years now." Sarah paused, letting his words sink in. "No further questions," she said. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brief. Carter asked about the theft, pressing James on whether he knew it was wrong. "I knew," James said. "But I was hungry. I didn't see no other way." As James stepped down, the courtroom felt different. The judge's expression was unreadable, but her eyes followed him back to the defense table. The jurors whispered among themselves, and even the bailiff, who had maintained a stoic demeanor, seemed to soften. Closing arguments were starkly different in tone. Carter reiterated the law. Theft was theft, regardless of circumstance. "We cannot excuse crimes because of personal hardship," he said. "The law applies to everyone." Sarah, in her closing, painted a broader picture. James Harris is not a criminal. He is a man who served his country, who saved lives, and who has been left to fend for himself. He took a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a bottle of water, not out of greed, but out of desperation. This is not about excusing a crime. It's about understanding a man. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman, the Vietnam veteran, stood and delivered the verdict, not guilty. A murmur of approval passed through the courtroom. Judge Ellis nodded, her face still stern but her eyes betraying a flicker of relief. "Mr. Harris," she said, "you are free to go. But before you do, I want to say something." She paused, looking directly at him. "This court recognizes your service and your sacrifice. What happened to you after is a failure, not yours but ours. I hope you find the support you deserve." James nodded, his eyes glistening. "Thank you, ma'am." As he walked out of the courtroom, a free man, the bailiff clapped him on the shoulder. A juror approached, offering a handshake. The story of James Edward Harris didn't end there, but in that moment, he was seen, not as a homeless man, not as a defendant, but as a hero who had never stopped fighting. Word of the trial spread quickly. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon, veterans organizations reached out. A nonprofit offered James temporary housing and job training. A VA counselor expedited his benefits. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. His struggles were far from over, but it was a start. For the first time in years, James felt like he wasn't invisible. The courtroom that day became a mirror, reflecting not just one man's story, but a nation's obligation to those who serve. James Edward Harris, the Black homeless veteran on trial, had reminded them all of what it means to rise.